And so now we'll move on to our next in-person speaker. We have Lisa Marie Rand speaking on From Sputnik to Starlink, a historical perspective on astronomy and satellite communications. So you can come on up.
So thank you very much, Jessica and John, for inviting me to join this important conversation. And also thank you to Elder Wilfred Buck, Alvin, and Juan Carlos for setting a tone and intention for this session this week, and I hope well beyond. So I am a historian who's interested in the ways that different communities engage with outer space as a natural environment at risk. And in my talk today, I hope to provide some, what I hope is relevant historical context for the current controversies surrounding satellite constellations, and to note some of the ways that the international astronomical community, and even the IAU in particular as an institution, has addressed remarkably similar technological dilemmas at the start of the satellite era. So I'm going to begin at the beginning by setting the technological scene for those of you who are not Cold War historians or space history enthusiasts. So the first satellite, Sputnik 1, reached orbit in October 1957, and it and its immediate predecessors that reached orbit were not true communication satellites. They could transmit a pre-recorded signal, but they could not relay signals sent from one point on the ground to another point on the ground. And at the same time that these first satellites reached outer space, the Soviet Union and the United States also began conducting nuclear tests, weapons tests at the nearest edges of outer space. So with projects Argus and Hardtack in 1958, continued into the early 1960s, with tests like Starfish Prime, which disabled several early satellites. These really demonstrated the vulnerability of the outer space environment to nuclear attack, with radio blackouts occurring for extended periods of time after each test. So in response to these, the United States Army Signal Corps convened a summer study in 1958 to consider the future of military communications, with this main goal of really trying to figure out how best to use this brand new form of technology, the artificial satellite, to increase the ability for the US Armed Forces to communicate with each other, particularly in this moment of intense geopolitical instability and this nuclear threat. And one of the most promising ideas to come out of this summer study didn't really resemble what you and I potentially might think of when we think of a communications satellite. So the working name for this system was initially Project Needles, which is an apt description of the satellites that made up that system, which they were these tiny copper filaments, only a few centimeters long, thinner than a human hair, shown here against an unidentified finger for scale. And each of these tiny satellites served as a passive microwave signal reflector. And the test version that was conceived of at that summer study included some 400 million of them deployed into a diffuse band about 3,500 kilometers above Earth's surface. And the way the system worked was pretty simple. It was intended to mimic the naturally occurring ionosphere, the atmospheric layer that's used for long-range radio communications. So it was like the natural ionosphere, but they thought it would also just be better, right? It would be more resilient, less susceptible to natural variations, things like jamming, like attacks, including nuclear attacks. So do I have a thing here? No. Okay, I was hoping I could point. So a microwave signal would be sent from a powerful transmitter on one point to the ground, reach the belt, be scattered in all different directions, be picked up by a receiver on the ground. So all the expensive, complex equipment that might need to be maintained would be on the ground, and the space components made of this cheap, available industrial material installed with a single launch, or even piggybacked on another defense payload, which was gold, even cheaper for the Department of Defense. So with two belts, one clustered around the equator and one around the poles, a dipole scatter system like this could provide worldwide coverage with no more than maybe one or two transfer points on the ground, and with opportunities for infinite channels. Not particularly secure, not particularly high fidelity, but lots and lots of channels. The MIT Lincoln Laboratory took this up and sought to test it out and received funding from the US Air Force to develop and launch a preliminary version of this system. However, the Lincoln Laboratory researchers grew concerned that these reflective dipoles might have some detrimental effects on astronomical research. So they sought the guidance of the newly formed Space Science Board of the US National Academy of Sciences to vet the safety of the classified project. The board convened an ad hoc committee of astronomers and a few engineers to consider how the dipoles would interact with the outer space environment and also assess or predict any potential impacts on scientific research. Also, interestingly, they were tasked with thinking about ways that the project might be received by scientists and also just everyday citizens around the world. And by April 1960, they delivered a preliminary report that acknowledged the utility of the program, but one person's valuable communications infrastructure is another person's dangerous pollution. And they ultimately urged the Air Force not to go through with the test due to, again, these potentially detrimental effects on optical and radio astronomy. Now, their concerns were less over the test belt as it was proposed, but more about what might happen if that test belt was successful. A fully functional system could do some terrible things to the study of outer space, they imagined, with two dense belts of reflective material, that this could yield an unacceptable rise in noise and false signals for optical astronomy and radio astronomy. And worse, it might set a dangerous precedent. Those were their words, a dangerous precedent. That once the United States has its own two belts of dipoles, what's to stop the Soviet Union from having theirs, and then Europe from having theirs, and then every nation with a space industry will suddenly want its own dipole clouds, and then outer space will be full of this reflective material. By June 1960, a second draft of this report comes out that changes the overall position to recommending, but with caution. And many members of the ad hoc committee were actually pretty upset about this. They thought that the SSB chair's change in position was a way of pacifying military leadership, but that chair, Lloyd Berkner, was familiar with working with federal agencies and thought it best to catch flies with honey, right? That the military was likely to do this anyway, and astronomers could protect their interests if they went along with some of these plans rather than being in direct opposition. And compromise came in an agreement among the group to declassify parts of this formerly secret project to solicit feedback from a broader quorum of experts. And I wanted to note that in advance of this declassification, they changed the name to Project Westford, which kind of softened the material identity of this project, since a needle can be potentially harmful or painful in some contexts. So from here on, I will be referring to this again as Project Westford. And there were still pretty high levels of dissent when members of this ad hoc committee and researchers from the Lincoln Laboratory published information about the dipole system in an April 1961 edition of the Astronomical Journal. The articles in this special edition emphasized the safety of the project to radio and optical astronomy and described some interesting ways in which the outer space environment itself would ensure that the test belt would be temporary, that like with many kind of industrial processes, that the natural environment of outer space would be relied upon to clean up after anthropogenic projects where humans create the messes. And I'll explain this a little bit more shortly. That said, this publication really did more to fan the fire of dissent than assure astronomers that the project was safe. Upon reviewing letters exchanged across North America and across the oceans, I found that astronomers saw Westford as a kind of an ominous portent of a dangerous future. Some predicted that Westford heralded an inevitable trend of pollution in outer space, one that could yield great horror for all of humanity if not sensitively managed. Some suggested the formation of an international space pollution control agency helmed by scientists to ward off or at least slow the accumulation of artificial material in space. And another even argued that a catastrophe on the level of World War II was at stake should no steps be taken to ward off Westford and stem the pollution of the nearest reaches of outer space. And epistolary, basically, this is Godwin's law, right? In these epistolary exchanges between astronomers in the early 1960s, I could not make this stuff up if I tried. This all came to a head the following summer at the 11th General Assembly meeting of the IAU in Berkeley, California. President Kennedy sent a greeting that was published in the daily program that lauded astronomy as literally above politics, surpassing boundaries in favor of research and knowledge production, and sent UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson to address the assembly. Stevenson called for the need for politicians to learn from scientists and argued that scientists, like the astronomers at the IAU, were the proper watchdogs to safeguard the world powers, or to police the world powers, really, as they pushed into new arenas of science and technology. At the same meeting, mere days after Stevenson's address, the IAU put out a resolution against Westford. And the resolution issued a warning that the integrity of orbital space for scientific research could be threatened by systems like Westford. The membership, as reflected in this resolution, positioned astronomers as kinds of canaries in the coal mine of outer space. And the resolution states that no group has the right to change Earth's environment, which includes outer space, to kind of refer back to some of what Alvin mentioned earlier, in any significant way without full international study and agreement. In the resolution, it requests that governments with space industries consult with the IAU before launching potentially dangerous space projects. And the IAU was joined in similar resolutions by organizations including the American Astronomical Society, the International Union of Radio Science, the French and Belgian National Academies of Science, the Royal Astronomical Society, the Committee on Space Research of the International Council of Scientific Unions, and on and on. Many of these resolutions came out. And eventually, the US Department of State entered the fray to help mediate the dispute because it clearly had some international relations ramifications. And one official privately noted that astronomers seem to be a remarkably noisy and parochial group. Now, why? Why might they have thought this? I mean, the threat to existing observational practices, of course, but also at roughly the same time that the Westford controversy was raging, the first space telescopes were being developed. And at the IAU, the same IAU meeting, there was a whole exhibit dedicated to explaining the design and functioning of the first proposed OAOs. And the American Astronomical Society's anti-Westford resolution specifically condemned the threat to space observatories that were scheduled to be operational within the next 2 to 3 years. And as you all likely know, right, space observatories promise to open whole new parts of the spectrum to observation far above the obstructive effects of the atmosphere. So a future of dipole belts meant that this revolution might end before it even got off the ground. By extending some of the same effects of the industrial atmosphere that's long plagued astronomers to new heights, and forcing space telescopes to even higher and more dangerous and more expensive altitudes. Now, in spite of this, the Air Force did launch a Westford package later in 1961. It failed to deploy. And in the lead up to a new attempt, astronomers sought to amplify their protests further. Many who sought to put an end to Westford and what it might imply held a deep conviction in the cultural and even the moral authority enjoyed by astronomers around the world, and that moral authority would bolster their cause. So they engaged mainstream audiences, particularly through interviews with journalists writing for popular presses, who then took up the cause as one about a kind of environmental morality. They portrayed Westford as an act of littering on a grand scale by a national military without the consent of citizens on the ground below. Littering represented an ongoing locus of conflict in cities around the world. It was an act increasingly bound to criminal consequences, in America at least since the early 1950s. And kind of the argument is, if urban dwellers could be fined for dumping things that they don't want into, let's say, an empty lot, why should governments be allowed to get away with the same thing in outer space? Additionally, as some of you may recall, in 1962, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson was published. It was this watershed book that's credited with accelerating mainstream environmentalist politics. And Silent Spring really drove home the unintended and often invisible consequences wrought by pesticide programs and nuclear tests. It made it very clear to readers around the world. And Carson, in this book, really suggested that coalitions of unbiased experts and an educated populace really provided the best bulwark against such large-scale environmental threats imposed by governments upon non-consenting societies. So whether knowingly or not, astronomers' efforts to publicize their fears about Westford yielded just this kind of coalition, and eventually it did bear fruit. So in the lead up to the second, ultimately successful launch in May 1963, Westford's designers and the Air Force heeded requests by astronomers to alter the Westford payload to ensure that the dipoles would only be released if the canister that was deploying them reached a resonant orbit. And what this means is that at the planned 3,500 kilometer altitude, Westford's designers they predicted that sunlight pressure would push these high mass to area ratio dipoles back into the atmosphere over the course of a few short years, which would render temporary any potentially negative impediments to present and future observing practices. So most astronomers were pretty satisfied with this, not all, but many were, that they were being listened to and heeded. And the second launch successfully deployed the dipoles at that resonant orbit in May of 1963. And shortly after, the belt successfully transmitted a signal between California and Massachusetts. And as planned, solar pressure, friction, and gravity did bring most of those dipoles back within a few years, but not all of them. Some dipoles succumbed to surface pressure and clumped together, ruining their mass-to-area ratio, and some of those clumps are still there. They're being cataloged continuously, and they continue to be tracked by the Space Surveillance Network. Now, fortunately, the Westford test did not yield. Let's see. My slide is not advancing. Hopefully it'll get there. So the Westford test did not really yield any of the feared effects. The dipoles were barely detectable, and I have an image of this here. What's it? Yeah, it's not. There we go. That's the image taken by a Baker-Nunn camera. We can see here in this long exposure image of the dispenser, it's really hard to see anything. The belt's very faint. You can sort of see it inclined a little bit if you look really closely, a few degrees to the star trails, and it had no measurable impact on the practices of professional optical and radio astronomers. But the experiment was never repeated. As you all likely know, in spite of this successful test, there are currently no dipole belts scattering microwave signals in orbit. There's likely a few reasons for this. One was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which passed that same year, made those exoatmospheric nuclear tests that Westford was designed to protect against moot, or likely moot, obviously, less of an imminent need. The rise of higher fidelity active satellites with electronics on board that could amplify signals from place to place, that made the dipole belt system seem less attractive. And as some advocates of Westford claimed, also potentially a bad reputation, right? That this coalition of experts and an educated populace together doomed this project by a bad reputation. So Westford's been largely forgotten in the 60 years since its second launch. I'm not sure if anyone here has ever heard of it before. If you have, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. But its legacy really endures in the language of the Outer Space Treaty, which is the preeminent document of international space governance, which, like the IAU resolution of 1961, calls for international consultation before the launch of any potentially harmful space experiment. And it also endures in current debates over the safety of a different kind of communication satellite system. You may have heard, as I've been speaking today, some of the similarities between responses to Westford and responses to this rise of satellite constellations. So as the first... We've got maybe like 2 minutes. Okay, great, sure. So as the first sets of Starlink satellites launched, I noticed some astronomers' responses to it were really similar to the early 1960s, but with very different outcomes so far. So I'll go over this very briefly. That there's some similarities and differences between Westford and, say, Starlink as one of the kind of more well-understood, well-known constellations. Westford took place early in satellite technology design. The state of the art had not yet settled. There were a lot of potential options of what that satellite might take, whereas that's a little more settled now. The geopolitical realities are different, including kind of the nuclear threats posed in the early 1960s versus now. Westford was publicly funded. Starlink is privately funded, right? These are pretty different, with different outcomes, right? A private program is not subject to the same kind of bureaucratic oversight as a public one. The regulatory landscape has changed, as kind of Karen brought up a little bit. Concerns about losing businesses to other nations if there's too much oversight. That's something that I hear a lot in policy circles now. The moments in mainstream environmental politics are different, especially, I think, in this era of Silent Spring, the rise of mainstream environmentalism versus this moment of this manufactured controversy over climate change. something that was in fact manufactured by some credentialed scientists, right, which also may potentially have damaged the moral authority of scientists that Westford-era astronomers enjoyed, and I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on that as well. So I'm presenting this to you in hopes that having a sense of the history of astronomers' attention to the potential harms of novel communication satellites has a much longer history than our current moment, and it's worth examining what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what lessons we might take from the rhymes of history to apply to our current moment. Thank you very much.